when dealing with psychiatric diagnosis there. Okay, well, it's clearly easier to spot autism at the low functioning end, where children and adults are grossly impaired in their everyday interactions, in their language, in their movements, in their thinking here, because it's just more obvious. When we go up the spectrum of impairment towards Asperger's and through that into high functioning autism, right the way through into seemingly typical everyday behaviour, it becomes quite an objective thing to spot. So has a person got Asperger's, or are they just a little bit extrovert? Is there something quirky about them? Or is it a clinical condition? Are there brain correlates? Is there something different about their genes, something different about the way their brains function, put together, structured, that clearly define them from your everyday person or neurotypical person? Well, there has to be a line in the sand, or a borderline, where we say, this is autism, this isn't autism, this is Asperger's, this isn't Asperger's. And often it might be the case that a person grows into their Asperger's or grows into their autism and seemingly has become fully functioning. So they move into a more socialized, if you like, or a more normal way of holding themselves. That doesn't mean to say they think like a normal person. Doesn't mean to say they haven't got the high sensory sensitivities that are seen in autism. So there can be a lot of differences, if you like, under the hood, under the bonnet going on there. So the presentation of the normal self doesn't mean to say that a person hasn't got autism. Asperger's and autism can affect at every different level, right the way up the spectrum there. So high functioning children do adapt. They do function sometimes just as well as any other child, but they often have peculiarities that can be picked up on. As I said before, unfortunately, often they're bullied at school. This is one of the reasons why early intervention is critical there. Younger children have a greater degree of brain plasticity, as it's called, or the ability to restructure or form neurons or neuronal connections, if you like, that will lead to the brain taking on board information. If you see it, if you adopt an information processing approach, as some academics see it, the brain essentially is a lot of connections. Neurons communicate, synapses fire along strings, if you like, and it's that connectivity in the brain, or the rewiring of the brain, that if you put into place early interventions for children, are seen to form this better prognosis, or this better outcome. So essentially, I think across academics there's general agreement that the earlier you do an intervention, if that's indeed what you want to do, the better it is for the later outcome of the child or the adult. There are very few tools that are sensitive to the adolescent or adult autism there. Most often people are diagnosed with autism very early on, certainly in the more profound cases of autism there. But often you can get self-diagnosed autism. People realise that they're having problems, or certain traits that they identify as autism there, and they will self-refer, and then sometimes attract, say, something like a diagnosis of Asperger's, for instance. This is common the case. I don't often do anecdotes, but it's common the case where people will come along to the clinician's office for their child, and the child will attract a diagnosis of autism, and the clinician will pick up on some autistic traits in one or both of the parents, and then subsequently a parent will attract a diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome. This is a common sort of anecdotal story that goes around some of the conferences, which really presses home the fact, the notion that autism in most instances, at least in its more profound disabling expressions, is a genetic condition. Okay. Yeah, no offence, Brett. Sorry, I know you're the parent of a child on the autistic spectrum. Brett's laughing. Late screening there can be difficult in adults. I think it's fair to say that this is a problematic area for adults and adolescents with autism. I'm going to move on, and really I'm going to have to wrap up very, very soon, because I know I'm eating into and exceeding my time here. Is there a cure for autism? Now, before everyone throws apples at me, I think it's fair to say that from an academic perspective, it's true to say that no, there isn't a cure. And why should there be a cure if you don't characterize it as an illness? And it's up to you whether you take, a medical model approach to what autism is. The research pushes forward with certain assumptions about what is and what isn't normal functioning. There is, unfortunately, this word normal or normal functioning, and people with autism do deviate from that. When we talk of a medical condition or an illness, you have to, by virtue of the linguistic nature of the things we're describing, talk of a cure. Well, autism is a lifelong disorder. There are reported cases of remission from autism, but it's commonly thought that generally there is no cure for autism as such. And the symptoms are lifelong, so they affect a person throughout their life. That doesn't mean to say that a person can't improve or shift up and indeed down there. So people have opinions on this, and I'd urge you to listen and share knowledge and be tolerant of all opinions on this. And there are fundamentalists within the autistic community that absolutely deny that autism is an illness, and I think there are places for people who have strong opinions on this, but there's also a place for a more moderate line that does seek to alleviate the symptoms along the medical model line of what autism might be considered as. So people do make good progress, and they do develop coping strategies as they grow through autism. There are a range of therapies and treatments, but there's no real consensus on what's most effective. You have things like ABA, Applied Behavioural Analysis. You have things generally that are considered to be highly effective and reported in the academic literature as showing vast improvement if early intervention is put in place. And there's broad criticism of those claims, but there's also a lot of tolerance, if you like, for improvements shown when this is done, I think, intensively from a very young age. So, for instance, you can give severely disabled children a working vocabulary, if not a verbal vocabulary, from a very young age, given appropriate interventions. It's beyond the remit of this talk to go into that, but just to say there are differing opinions on that.